Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of digital fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn. Today's video is the start of our set review for Murders at KARLOV Manor. Now, I haven't done a set review in quite a while, but I think it's time to get back on the horse, so to speak, and make these happen every time a new set comes out. We're going to be doing 7 videos, so one for each color, and then one that's colorless, and then one that's multicolored at the end. Also, my top 10 picks for constructed and my top 5 picks for limited are going to be a separate video after all the set review videos come out, so look forward to that. Also, after all of that, there's going to be another video detailing the 10 decks I'm most excited to brew as soon as the set launches on Tuesday, and that video you can use as a reference to vote on our Patreon poll for which deck tech you want to see happen first. So anybody that's a patron over on Patreon can vote on that, decide what order I do those decks in and what they want to see first, even if you're just at the $1 tier. So check out Patreon if you're interested in that. Also, if you're interested in specific cards and don't want to sit through an entire set review, I do have a spoiler short playlist for Murders at KARLOV Manor. I'm going to link that down below in the About section as well, so that if you're interested in any particular cards, you can look them up in my spoiler short section. With all that out of the way, let's get this thing started. We're starting with white. This is Absolving Lamassu, 1 white and 4 for a 4/3 flying Lamassu. When it enters the battlefield, all suspected creatures are no longer suspected, and when it dies, you gain 3 life and suspect up to 1 target creature an opponent controls. So this guy's kind of weird. When he comes into play, he's good on the defense if you're trying to shore up against an aggro deck or whatever. It helps remove menace from all of your opponent's creatures. It removes the ability to not block from all of your creatures. So very defensive play. But then when it dies, it kind of swaps to being a very aggressive card and supporting an aggressive playstyle, because then you're making something on their side unable to block. And trying to close out the game that way, which is kind of cool. But I think where this card really shines is just the fact that it's a 4-power flyer that is easily splashable with only 1 white mana in its cost. So this is going to be a really good card in limited. You're definitely going to want to consider this highly, I believe, in any deck that's playing white. Like I said, it's very splashable, so keep that in mind. Moving on, we've got Assemble the Players. This is 1 white and 1 for an enchantment. You may look at the top card of your library at any time, and once each turn you may cast a creature spell with power 2 or less from the top of your library. Now, this looks better than I think it is. A lot of times this is going to whiff. You know, having to use up a card and spend 2 mana, you have to play something from the top just to make up for playing this card, and then you have to play a second thing from the top to finally get value off this card, and having to spend 2 mana, spend part of your turn getting this out, and then having to carefully build around this card so that the density of power 2 creatures in your deck is high enough that you have a better chance of being able to use it. So it's kind of a build around. It's a build around that's not going to hit every time, that you have to hit twice before you get any payoff. So it is a little but there are 2 things going for this card that I'm pretty excited about. One being the fact that there is a power 2 or less sort of build around archetype within this set. So it's possible that this card, in conjunction with the other things that care about power 2 or less, it could be super valuable that way, because if you're already playing a power 2 or less deck to get value off the other cards that do this sort of stuff, this could just be worth including to get even more value, even if maybe in a traditional deck it might not be worth building around this as an archetype just for this card. So keep that in mind. The other thing that I think this would be cool for is if you're playing a flash deck. There are a lot of flash creatures, especially soldiers in white and blue, fairies, that it says you can do this once a turn, right? Not just once on your turn, once each turn. So you could play a flash creature from the top of your deck on your turn, say go, and then flash something else in from the top of your deck on their turn because it has flash. So I think that is a way to sort of make this card a little bit better than it otherwise might be. So We're gonna try it in Flash at some point. We're gonna see how it goes. Next up, we've got Aurelias Vindicator. I actually really love this card. This is a 4/2 flying lifelink Ward 2 Angel for 2 white and 2. It has disguise for 1 white, 3, and X. That means you can play this as essentially a morph creature, a disguised creature, for 3 mana, comes in as a colorless 2/2 with Ward 2, and then at any point in time you can pay that disguise cost to turn it face up into the actual Aurelias Vindicator. When it's turned face up, you exile up to X other target creatures from the battlefield and or creature cards from graveyards, and when Aurelias Vindicator leaves the battlefield, you return the exiled cards to their owner's hand. Now, this can be used in so many different ways that I love it. First of all, just an Angel Tribal, playing this on turn 3 after turn 2 Giada, because Giada helps you pay for it, is pretty powerful. Having a 4/2 flying lifelink Ward 2 as early as turn 3, that's also going to come in with a +1/+1 counter because of Giada. Even that just on its own is pretty powerful, and the fact that in that deck, if you get this later on in the game and you have the mana lying around, you can just put it in as a disguised creature and just almost immediately flip it to get some value. So that versatility in an Angel deck, I think, makes this guy really good. But there's also multiple ways you can use Aurelias Vindicator, even outside of Angel Tribal. So the important thing to notice is you get to exile X things, but it can be creature cards from the battlefield or creature cards from graveyards. So the obvious way to use this is to hit a couple creatures on your opponent's side and get rid of them. Use this as removal, right? But another way you could use this is exile a bunch of things from your own graveyard, and if they ever kill the Vindicator, you get all that stuff back into your hand. So you can use this as sort of like a protection, and you can even use this as like Sunfall protection, because if they Sunfall, it isn't a die trigger, right? So even if it gets exiled, it's when it leaves the battlefield, you get the cards back. So you can kind of set yourself up with some Sunfall protection by, you know, using this guy's ability to exile stuff in your own graveyard. And now if they want to cast Sunfall, you're getting a bunch of creatures back, a bunch more gas so that you can continue the game. But it's worth noting that even if you use this as removal, the stuff goes back to their owner's hands. So it's not like if they kill the Vindicator, now they get their creatures back on their board, right? They go back to their hands and they have to recast them. So there's even a tempo advantage built into it. So there's a lot of different ways you can use this that I think are easily missable at first. So definitely look out for those. But I'm interested in brewing with it for sure, especially in Angel Tribal. I think it's going to be a slam dunk in that deck. Moving on, we've got Auspicious Arrival. 1 white and 1 for an instant. Target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn, and you investigate. This is just a combat trick for limited. It is going to be pretty good in limited, though. Being able to use this on a key turn to make sure their creature dies and yours doesn't is pretty good on its own, but this sort of effect being stapled to making an investigate token, a clue token with investigate, you get sort of a cantrip effect. You get built-in card advantage where this thing replaces itself when you use it, and that means even if you're not able to get the most value out of it, you can still use it to great effect and then replace itself with the clue token. So I think it's a pretty good pick for limited. Moving on, we've got Call a Surprise Witness. 1 white and 1 for a sorcery. Return target creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Put a flying counter on it. It's a spirit in addition to its other types. I think this is one of the better versions of this type of spell that we've seen. It's going to be really good in limited because flying is super good in limited, and being able to turn your best 3-drop or less in the yard that your opponent killed early into a flying win condition is never gonna be bad in limited. But I think this card even has a chance in certain decks in standard that want this type of effect. I think depending on the deck and depending on the creatures, that flying counter could matter a lot more than some of the other upsides we've seen on similar cards. So definitely awesome in limited, and it's probably going to see play in something in constructed. Next up, we got Casefile Auditor. 1 white and 2 for a 1/4 human detective. When Casefile Auditor enters the battlefield, and whenever you solve a case, look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal an enchantment card from among them, put it into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. You may spend mana as though it were mana of any color, to cast case spells. So this is basically the case tribal guy. And it's cool to see this at uncommon because it means that there's probably some kind of, even if it's not a common archetype within limited, there's probably at least sort of an uncommon archetype you can try to pursue where you go like 5 color cases, which could be really awesome. Coffee breaks are important. But the fact that this triggers when it enters the battlefield, right? You get to grab a case or any enchantment, basically, from the top, what is it? 6? Top 6. Makes this pretty good even if they just kill it, right? And then every single time you solve a case, you get to grab another one or another enchantment. It makes me wonder if this might be viable for constructed. I think this could be a sleeper, and that there might be a constructed case deck, 5-color case deck, especially with some of the 5-color support that we've seen in this set that we'll get to in other videos down the line. But very interesting to see if there is an archetype within limited we can push with this, and even more interested to see if we can actually maybe try to make a standard deck that's just 5-color cases, because it's an awful lot of value, especially because it triggers on ETB as well. Moving on, speaking of cases, we've got Case of the Gateway Express. This is 1 white and 1. When it enters the battlefield, choose target creature you don't control. Each creature you control deals 1 damage to that creature. So it's basically removal. You want to go wide, and then you nuke one of their dudes. But then it just sits on the battlefield. That's what these cases do. They sit on the battlefield, and they have a solve condition. And at the end of your turn, every one of your turns, it's going to check that solve condition to see if it becomes solved or not. In this case, the solve condition is 3 or more creatures attacked this turn. So at the end of every one of your turns, it's going to check and see if 3 or more creatures attacked. And if so, it's going to become solved. And as soon as it becomes solved, the last ability comes online, essentially. And that's creatures you control get +1/+0. So this is removal that turns into like half of a wedding announcement. Buffs all of your creatures' power once you become aggressive enough. I think this card is really good, both in limited and even in constructed, to be completely honest. Being able to get extra value off your removal is always a good thing, and I don't think the solve state is that difficult to hit. So I think this card is pretty astounding, to be honest. Next up, we've got Case of the Pilfered Proof. Whenever a detective enters the battlefield, 1 white and 1 for a case. Whenever a detective enters the battlefield under your control, and whenever a detective you control is turned face up, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. To solve it, you control 3 or more detectives, and when it's solved, if 1 or more tokens would be created under your control, those tokens plus a clue token are created instead. This seems like a lot of value in a very specific deck for Detective Tribal. I think you're going to want to jam this if you're going super wide with a lot of detectives in limited. It's pretty good for that archetype. You only need 3 detectives on the board at the end of your turn to solve it, so that's nice. That's nice. And it's worth noting that when it becomes solved, you don't get rid of the initial ability. You always have that first ability on this enchantment. You just also get this second ability when it becomes solved. So no matter what, like, all of your detectives are coming into play or being turned up and getting extra +1/+1 counters. But then also, once you have 3, whenever you make a token, you get an extra clue token. So it's going to give you board presence at first. It's going to buff up all of your creatures if you're in that Detective Tribal, but then it's going to start to give you a ton of card advantage once it's solved, which at that point in the game, you're probably running out of gas if you already have 3 or more detectives. So I think this is going to hit pretty well as far as when you drop it in the curve and when you solve it and what you need to do at that point in the game. Definitely good in the detective archetype in limited. I wouldn't be surprised, again, if there is a standard detective deck, if that's good enough. I don't know if it will be, but if it is, I think this card will definitely be in it. Moving on, we've got Case of the Uneaten Feast. This is one of my favorite white cards. Just 1 white mana for an enchantment case. It's worth noting too, I really love these cases. Sagas were previously my favorite card type, and this sort of seems like, cases seem like sort of like a mashup between like sagas and I don't know, something else. Something that's not quite a saga. But this one is 1 white mana. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. So it's just like all those mana dorks that we've seen. 1 mana dorks that come down and they gain you a life every time you play a creature. Super integral to life gain decks to get life gain triggers for payoffs. Except this is on an enchantment, so it's harder to remove. So it's going to be, I think, a lot better than those, 1/1 creatures or whatever that have the same ability, because it's going to be a lot harder for your opponent to get rid of this card. To solve it, you've gained 5 or more life this turn, which again, in those life gain decks, not going to be difficult to solve it. And then when it's solved, at any point in time, you can sacrifice the case, and creature cards in your graveyard gain. You may cast this card from your graveyard until end of turn. So, this card's insanely powerful. It's worth noting that you don't have to sack the case as soon as it becomes solved. Once it becomes solved, it sits there solved forever, and you can sack it whenever you want. So you can wait until a perfect turn to basically play Yawgmoth's Will, but just for creatures, for free. You don't have to spend the 3 mana you normally have to spend for Yawgmoth's Will. So this comes down in your life gain deck, gets you a bunch of value and triggers. Eventually there's a turn where you gain 5 or more life, right? This becomes solved. It sits there until you're completely out of gas. Maybe your opponent wipes your board, and then you just sack it, and you get a free Yawgmoth's Will for creatures without having to spend any mana, which is kind of better than Yawgmoth's Will, because normally you can play less with Yawgmoth's Will because you have to pay 3 to cast it the same turn that you're using it to play things out of the graveyard. Granted, you can play anything, so you can, combo that card with Dark Ritual and all that stuff. So Yawgmoth's Will is obviously a better card at the end of the day. But as far as this being a standard legal card, that's essentially a Yawgmoth's Will for creatures, tacked onto an ability that's already really wanted in a life gain deck, I think this card is going to be absolutely bananas. We are absolutely brewing life gain. I've already got a life gain deck up on the channel that's pretty gnarly, and it's only going to get better with this card, so I'm super pumped about it. Moving on, we've got Defenestrated Phantom, a 4/3 spirit with flying for 2 white and 4. It has Disguise for 1 white and 4. I think this is pretty good at the common level. Seeing a 4-power flyer that can come out and start swinging by turn 5, if you plan ahead and you play this, as the 2/2 Ward 2 creature for 3, and then flip it on turn 5. It's also worth noting that if you're flipping it, it's easily splashable, only takes the 1 white. So I think this is very easy to splash as a win condition. I think a lot of decks will be able to do this. So as a common, something that you can pick up later in a draft, I think this card is pretty good if you're lacking threats to close out the game and you just need one. Since this is a common, it's probably still kicking around later in the draft, and you can easily pick it up and add this to your deck and help fulfill that side of your deck if you found yourself lacking come pack 3. Next up, we've got Dely, Streetwise Lookout, 1 white and 2 for a legendary human scout. It's a 2/2. Creatures you control with power 2 or less can't be blocked by creatures with power 3 or greater. And if an ability of a creature you control with power 2 or less triggers, that ability triggers an additional time. Now, I think what's going to make Dely good here is the fact that Dely is greater than the sum of its parts. The 2/2 body on a 3-drop is not good. Like, you're paddling upstream at that point. And then getting creatures you control with power 2 or less to essentially become unblockable by all but the smallest creatures is decent, but not amazing by itself. And the same thing with an ability of a creature you control with power 2 or less triggers, it triggers an additional time. Also a decent ability, still wouldn't be good enough by itself. But I think the fact that you get both of those abilities on the same card is what makes this strong, because the turn it comes down, it can immediately give this pseudo unblockability to whatever creatures you already played on turn 1 and 2, or if you're playing this later in the game, even more creatures, right? So you're getting value right then and there if you're in a very aggressive power 2 or less deck. And then if it survives the turn cycle, then it's doing stuff like letting your Brutal Cathars trigger a second time, which is pretty powerful as well. So the fact that it can kind of like pull double duty makes this a little bit better than it looks. That being said, at the end of the day, it's still a 2/2 for 3 that your opponent can easily just get rid of before it can do most of what it wants to do. So I'm not 100% sure on it. One thing that I am really looking forward to doing with this, though, is playing a Defense Matters deck with Bedrock Tortoise, because those creatures will all technically have power 2 or less, but be swinging in with much, much more damage potential because they do damage equal to their backside. So playing it with something like that is going to be awesome. And when we get to the green set review, there's another new card in this set in green that would slot perfectly into a deck like that as well. So I think that deck's going to be a thing, and I'm kind of excited to see how far we can push it. Moving on, we've got Due Diligence, 1 white and 2 for an enchantment aura. It enchants a creature, and whenever it enters the battlefield, target creature you control other than enchanted creature gets +2/+2 and gains Vigilance until end of turn, and then enchanted creature gets +2/+2 and has Vigilance. So this is a nice way of getting a little extra value off your aura in case they try to 2-for-1 the guy that you put it on. It's also giving something else +2/+2 in Vigilance. It's going to be kind of an important ability if you're sort of stalled out and you're going back and forth and you're trying to race your opponent in limited, being able to have 2 of your creatures get Vigilance and +2/+2 and swing in as part of the team. But then this +2/+2 in Vigilance is sticking around. It's not awful. That being said, you do have to have a specific board state set up to really make the best use of this card. So I don't know that it's going to be, you know, a high pick. This is probably going to be your 22nd, 23rd card kind of thing. But I've seen worse when it comes to abilities like these. Moving on, we've got Essence of Antiquity. This is a 1/10 artifact creature golem for 2 white and 3. It has Disguise for 1 white and 2. And when it's turned face up, creatures you control gain hexproof until end of turn. Untap them. So this card actually does a lot, even though it doesn't look like it. A 1/10 is kind of insane. The fact that you can flip it up, you know, at faster than instant speed with the disguise cost, and sort of surprise them with such a huge butt, it can be pretty overwhelming if you do it correctly in the right scenario in limited. But the fact that you can also turn it up and give everything hexproof until end of turn and untap them is also kind of wild, because this makes it a pretty gnarly combat trick where if you're racing your opponent and you're swinging in, they're swinging in, and they think they can swing in and safely get an attack in, and then you just disguise this guy, even if he's tapped and he swung in the turn before, you just unmask him, so to speak, flip him face up. Not only can this guy block their biggest dude, but all of your other guys untap and can block their dudes as well. Or if you just need to protect one of your creatures, you can also just turn this face up to get the hexproof and to basically cancel out one of their removal spells. So there's a lot of different ways you can use this to blow out your opponent, and I think that makes this card a lot more exciting than it otherwise would be. It also works pretty well with the power 2 or less matters theme that we've got going on. So I think there's a real chance this is going to be a contender in limited for sure. I think it can do a lot of different things that you want to do in a limited game and be versatile and do those at different points in the game depending on what you need. And I think that alone can be pretty darn powerful. So yes, limited, this guy, yes. Constructed, if that Defense Matters deck is a thing, like I said before, this could be a part of it for sure. Moving on, we've got Forum Familiar. This is 1 white for a 1/1 cat with Disguise, 1 white and 1. When it's turned face up, return another target permanent you control to its owner's hand and put a +1/+1 counter on Forum Familiar. This card's kind of weird. First of all, if you're just playing it as a 1-drop 1/1, it's awful. Like, you're never getting anything off that card that is worth the 1 mana or just the 1 card in your hand investment. If you play it morphed, if you play it disguised, and then flip it up later, like, you have a 2/2 ward 2, and yes, it gets a counter on it when it flips face up, but it's a 1/1, so it basically stays a 2/2 and just loses the ward. So you're basically paying 2 mana to have it lose ward and bounce a permanent you control to owner's hand. And at that point, like, if you're trying to reuse a really good ETB on a creature, why not just draft another one of those creatures, or another creature that has a really good ETB, and use that instead of this so that you don't have to jump through those hoops. I guess the one part that is really useful is if you're trying to save your creature at instant speed, if they're targeting it with removal, you can flip this, get a counter on it, save your thing, bring it back to your hand. And also if there's ways to flip this back down, when it becomes flipped back down, it doesn't technically leave play when it does that, so it'll keep the counter on it and then can unmask again, so to speak, and get another counter. So if you have ways of constantly flipping the Foreign Familiar back down, you can keep getting counters, which is kind of cool. But outside of that, and outside of maybe the trick of saving a guy in the right scenario, I don't know how good this card actually is. It's going to take some testing, but my gut tells me it's too slow and just doesn't do enough to be worth it. We've also got Griff Knot Tracker here. This is 1 white and 3 for a 3/2 human detective with flying. When it enters the battlefield, exile up to 2 target cards from a single graveyard. This card is just ho-hum. You know, it's a common, but it is a 3-power flyer for 4 mana. It is splashable. Evasion's really important and limited, so it will see some play, but I have a feeling, you know, it's going to be one of those 22nd, 23rd card kind of scenarios. It's worth noting that because it's a detective, it slots really well into Detective Tribal while giving you, you know, flying, giving you evasion. And I don't know how prevalent evasion, especially flying, is going to be among detectives, so that could be a very sought after thing. If Detective Tribal is the archetype you're going for, you might not have too many options for flying, and the detective payoffs that you get might be so good that it makes playing something like this and being able to get the detective payoffs while also getting a flying creature, which is really important in limited, it might be very worth it. So my gut says 22nd, 23rd card in limited kind of thing, but it could be a lot better than that in Detective Tribal. Moving on, we've got Hazda Vigilante. This is 1 white and 4 for a 4/4 giant soldier. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control with power 2 or less. So this card's kind of interesting. Overall, I feel like all of the commons are a lot better in this set than they have been in the past. And that could just be my perception. But I know they did change the way drafting works. They changed the draft packs and set packs to now we have just play packs, play boosters. And the makeups of those are very different. So there's, instead of there used to be about 100 commons and 80 uncommons, now there's about 80 commons and 100 uncommons. So there's a lot more uncommons and a lot less commons. So having less commons, having the playability of the commons be greater, means I think it's going to be a lot harder to like whiff when you're putting together a sealed deck or a draft deck. And that's kind of interesting to me, you know? There's a lot more playability among all these commons. But this guy in particular, I think the fact that he triggers when he enters the battlefield is what kind of makes him considerable. I think if he didn't have that part of it, he'd be a little ho-hum. But he's also kind of a nombo with, you know, the power 2 or less theme. Because you can only put a counter on a creature with power 2 or less. But as soon as you put a counter on a creature that has power 2, it becomes power 3. And whatever abilities you have that trigger on power 2 creatures go away. So, I don't know. We're going to have to test this guy, but he could provide a lot of value. A lot of streams of +1/+1 counters. He could be worth using in the right deck, but we'll have to see. We've also got Inside Source here. This is 1 white and 2 for a 1/1 human citizen. When he enters the battlefield, you create a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token, and then you can pay 3 and tap him. Target detective you control gets +2/+0 and vigilance until end of turn. Activate only as a sorcery. This card is one of the better commons that we've seen. Getting a, you know, 3 power, 3 toughness worth of power toughness across 2 bodies for 3 mana is pretty good for a common. But having this extra ability built in where you don't have to just use your 1/1 as a 1/1 that's somewhat useless outside of chump blocking, you can use its ability to make one of your other detectives into like a 4/2 or maybe even bigger and give it vigilance so that they have to trade with it. If they're not running a bunch of like 2 power creatures that can trade up with whatever you use this ability on, you're constantly swinging in for 4 or more damage with Vigilance. So it's like they either trade with it so that it can't block when they attack the next turn, or they let it through and then it can block and they're winning the race. I think in Detective Tribal, if you have enough detectives, this card can just keep going and going and going, and really force each of its creatures to be a much bigger threat that you have to deal with on a one-on-one basis, more so than they would be without this card. And the fact that it gives you a 2/2, your first 2/2 token to use with it, along with it when it comes into play, I think makes this pretty powerful. This might be the better common in white, to be honest. Moving on, we've got KARLOV Watchdog. This is 1 white and 3 for a 3/2 Vigilance dog. Permanents your opponent's control can't be turned face up during your turn, and whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. So this kind of does a lot. It's worth noting that it doesn't say other creatures you control get +1/+1 till end of turn. So as long as you have 2 other attacking creatures and the dog swings as a 4/3 Vigilance and buffs up the other 2 creatures, and more creatures if you're attacking with more. That alone is pretty powerful in limited. But the fact that permanents your opponent's control can't be turned face up during your turn means that they can't blow you out with tricks with their disguise guys or their cloak guys. So having that kind of tacked on to a card that's already pretty good without it, I think makes this card a pretty high pick. I wouldn't quite say first pickable or the best uncommon in white, but I think this is a lot better than it looks when you take into account the fact that it triggers itself and all that. So definitely look out for this card. Definitely consider running it. Next up, we've got Covod Honch, 1 white for an artifact food equipment. It equips for 2 mana, gives equipped creature +2/+0. You can also pay 2 and tap and sack the Covod Honch to gain 3 life. And whenever it's put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you may pay 2 mana if you do create 2 1/1 white dog creature tokens. This does a lot. I like the design that they're going for here, where typically its equipment doesn't get used as much as I think they want it to, because you have to use up an entire card in your deck, an entire card in your hand, to play something that's only going to help a creature, right? And if you don't have any creatures to put it on, it's kind of a dead card. Because of that, people have limited themselves to how many equipments they'll actually include in their decks, especially in limited decks in previous sets. But the fact that this can give you creatures and has extra utility uses on top, I think makes this card a lot better than your typical equipment. I think this will absolutely see play in limited for sure. It's possible it could see play in constructed, because you could do things like sacrifice it to an Oni Cult Anvil and pay the 2 to get 2 more 1/1s. So you only paid, what, 2 mana and basically got 3 1/1s out of that. The fact that ability can trigger whenever this is put into the graveyard from the battlefield in any way, it doesn't have to be sacking it to gain the 3 life, I think makes that ability pretty good. So I wouldn't be surprised if this shows up in some pretty interesting standard brews, and I definitely think it's got a strength that most equipment doesn't have for limited, in that it's not a dead card if you're out of creatures. So I think this will all be a really good limited card as well. Definitely keep your eye on it. Next up, we've got Makeshift Binding, 1 white and 2 for an enchantment. It's a common. When it enters the battlefield, exile target creature an opponent controls until Makeshift Binding leaves the battlefield. You gain 2 life. So this ability, this way of removing by exiling on a 3 mana enchantment is pretty on rate. We've seen it many times before. But the fact that you just gain 2 life and it's a common, I think makes this card way better than it looks. You're going to be able to pick this up pretty easily in a draft later on in a pack, where you're not sacrificing getting a really good pick in order to grab your removal. And when you get this removal, you get this extra utilitarian life gain just tacked on just cuz. Now, for constructed, the fact that it can only hit a creature is going to matter, and I don't know if this actually sees play. But in limited, this is going to be premier removal that's going to be really easy to get your hands on since it's at common. And I expect this to see play everywhere without needing to be first picked. Next up is Make Your Move. We've got 1 white and 2 for an instant. Destroy target artifact, enchantment, or creature with power 4 or greater. The versatility here is good. And the fact that this set is very centered around clue tokens means you're going to have a lot more artifact targets than you traditionally would for a card like this. And that makes this card a little bit better than it appears on the surface. Also take into account that there's an enchantment sub-theme as well with all of the cases. So the artifact and enchantment destruction potential of this is a little bit better in this set than it is in any normal limited environment. And that makes this card overall a little bit better than it looks on the surface. The fact that it can hit a big creature that's going to win the game, that's bomby, makes it pretty decent as well. And it's also a common. It's another one of those really good commons. And the doggo agrees. Next up, we've got Market Watch Phantom. This is 1 white and 1 for a 2/2 Spirit Detective. Whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, Market Watch Phantom gains flying until end of turn. This is one of those cards that can fit into the power 2 or less archetype. It can fit into the detective archetype. Or if you're really lucky and you happen to be able to cross-pollinate and play both those synergies in the same deck, this is a perfect inclusion. This is definitely something that's going to augment that deck, though. This card itself is not going to be something worth building around. You don't see this and go, oh, I want to go detectives, or oh, I want to go power 2 or less. Like, this is something that if you're already in those archetypes, it's an easy grab since it's a common later on in the draft to fill in some of your curve. And it's a perfect conclusion for those specific archetypes. Outside of those archetypes, it's pretty underpowered and pretty meh. But because of that, it's going to be really easy to pick up like really late in a draft because everyone else is just kind of passing over it. So like if you're in those archetypes, it's going to be a much more powerful pick later on in the draft than you would normally have access to at that point in a draft. Next up is Museum Night Watch. I'm going to take a little coffee break here. Oh, I talk too much. What can I say? 1 white and 3 for a 3/2 Centaur Soldier. When it dies, you create a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token, and it has Disguise for 1 white and 1. Pretty decent card. Even if you're just top decking it later in the game, you can just slam it for 4, have a 3/2 that trades with one of their creatures that has 3 toughness, and replaces itself with a 2/2, and all that's fine for 4 mana, even though it's not amazing. But where this is really going to shine is if you're playing against the kind of deck where you can kind of slow roll things and play this out as a 2/2 ward 2 on 3 and let it sit there and then just unmask it at the key opportunity where you can trade with something they don't expect you to be able to trade with because it's 3 power instead of 2, and also replace itself with a detective, you can kind of blow out your opponent if it's used just right. So this is another one of those commons that's a good example of a card that's super easy to pick up towards the end of a pack and can very easily fill out your deck in the spots that it needs to. Next up is Neighborhood Guardian, 1 white and 1 for a 2/2 Unicorn. Whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, target creature you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So this is a little bit underwhelming for an uncommon, to be honest. I feel like a couple of the commons were a little bit better than this. It is a good pickup for the power 2 or less archetype. If you're already in it for some of the other payoffs, this is going to be even more payoff, but it's not good enough on its own to push you into that archetype. That being said, it triggers off any creature with power 2 or less entering the battlefield. It doesn't have to be an actual card that was cast. So if there's any kind of like a token tribal sort of synergy within limited, it might be easy to just spam 2, 3, 4 tokens in one turn and just shoot off +1/+1 triggers everywhere. So if an archetype like that exists, this thing could be pretty gnarly as only a 2-drop. Might even be usable in just the right jank combo deck in Standard to do some pretty wild things out of nowhere. But I'm more likely inclined to believe that it's not going to see any play in Standard. And in Limited, you really got to already be in that archetype and just pick it up as extra value, I think, rather than like it being good enough to push you into playing that archetype by itself. Next up is Not on My Watch. 1 white and 1 for an instant. Exile target attacking creature. I think this is great. You're only going to be able to play this defensively, right? That's worth noting. So if you're playing an aggressive deck and you want to include a removal suite to get rid of your opponent's big blockers or their big utility creatures that they're not swinging with, like a 𝐒𝐈𝐿dred in standard or whatever, this isn't going to do that. And it's very important not to lose track of that, and not to forget that, because that limits what this can be used in pretty drastically. I still think it might see some standard play in very control-oriented decks where you're not really ever on the aggressive side of things, and you can afford to just sit back and you only have to worry about getting rid of their attackers. But I don't think it's going to see a ton of play. That being said, instant speed, 2 mana, exile instead of destroy is pretty powerful, and in limited, this thing is going to be everywhere. This is going to be a pretty high pick because it just exiles anything that's attacking. Your opponent's biggest threat that's coming in, well, now it's gone. And that's just, in limited, that's exactly what you want. So, yes, slam this thing. Next up, Novice Inspector. This is just Thraben Inspector, reprinted with a different name. 1 mana for a 1/2 human detective. When it enters the battlefield, investigate, which will create a clue token for you. I like the flavor here, and that they're insinuating that because this is a functional reprint of Thraben Inspector, they're almost like poking fun at Thraben and saying that like all of the inspectors that are Thraben are Novice Inspectors, which is kind of funny in my opinion. But this card is really good. Like, everybody already knows that Thraben Inspector is really good, so having a version of that for standard and for limited is going to be great. Gives you an early body. It can block 1/1s all day. It's, you know, real estate on the board to use for things down the line, like pumping or sacrificing or whatever. But it also gives you this clue token to eventually replace itself, or to just be used with other artifact synergies. So there's just a lot of versatility in how this works. And it's always going to be a great card. Even better that it has human and detective as its tribes. So it's going to be able to slot into those type of tribal decks a lot better and provide even more utility because of it. Moving on, we have No Witnesses. This is a rare sorcery for 2 white and 2, and this is the white sweeper of this set. Each player who controls the most creatures investigates, then you destroy all creatures. Now, I don't know if this is better than other sweeper variants that we have right now. Surely Sunfall is better, but that's at 5 mana. And sometimes you can set up the board state so that you are going to get value off this. Maybe you're running a lot of token creation with Wedding Announcement or something like that, and you're able to have slightly more creatures than your opponent, get a clue token, your opponent doesn't, and that could be pretty valuable. But overall, I think this is just going to be played in any deck that really needs a 4-drop sweeper instead of a 5-drop sweeper, and I think more and more we're going to start to see that become a bit more necessary as decks get even faster and even faster as more sets enter standard, now that we're in a 3-year rotation instead of 2. So it is possible we get to a point where you just need to sweep the board earlier than turn 5, and Sunfall alone isn't going to cut it. So something like this could come into the equation, and having ways to sort of brew around this card in a way that maybe gets you the payoff of the clue token instead of your opponent is pretty interesting, and there might be certain decks that can take advantage of that. Maybe decks that run like Urabrask's Forge, things like that, that have a lot of token creatures that are going to die anyway, and you just sweep them up with No Witnesses and get an extra clue token and destroy your opponent's stuff. That could be pretty fun. Moving on, we've got On the Job. 2 white and 2 for an instant. Creatures you control get +2/+1 until end of turn, and then you investigate. So this is just your, you know, white overrun effect, basically. This is your way to close out the game late in the game if you get enough creatures on the board and you just need to alpha strike. But what's cool about it is it also investigates, so normally a card like this isn't as useful outside of that specific gameplay scenario. game state scenario. But this giving you a clue token means maybe you just use this to get a little bit of value, get a little extra damage, or to trick your opponent and kill one of their creatures, you know, something like that, because you're going to get the clue token as well. So maybe in a situation where this isn't ending the game, it has a little more utility and a little more punch because it gets you some card advantage as well. And that might make this a little bit more usable than cards like this typically are. But again, this is going to be like your 23rd card in your limited deck, I think. We've also got Perimeter Enforcer, 1 white and 1 for a 1/1 human detective with flying and lifelink. Whenever another detective enters the battlefield under your control, and whenever a detective you control is turned face up, Perimeter Enforcer gets +1/+1 until end of turn. I can't say enough good things about this card, but I will after I have a coffee break. Nectar of the Gods. So, lifelink is huge in limited. Bigger than most people, I think, realize. Because it's all about racing. You know, you're trying to get there before your opponent. And lifelink just really helps mitigate whatever crackbacks they've got coming your way. Flying is equally as important in limited, because a lot of times it's stalls, it's creature standstills, board states that you can't push through. Having both of them on the same card and getting that creature to come into play for only 2 mana, you immediately have to like take note of that, for limited at least. This might be too slow for constructed, so I don't necessarily think it sees play there. But in limited, if you're in the detective archetype, and this guy can consistently get triggers, even if it isn't every turn, you know, but more turns than it doesn't, he's going to be really good. Like, if 2/3 of the time he's a 2/2 flying lifelink swinging in, just chipping away at that clock and then buffering your own life total so that your opponent can't race you, and the other 1/3 of the time it's just a 1/1 flying lifelink that's still pinging in like a deep cavern bat and getting you a little bit of life, and all the while it's very difficult to block this guy. And even if they do get out a big flyer, you can just let it sit there and eventually use its chump block the big flyer and gain a little bit of life in the process. So there's a little bit of versatility as well, and its tribal types matter a ton. Both human and detective are going to be huge, so I absolutely think this card's going to be nuts in limited, if you're in detectives. Next up, we've got Sanctuary Wall, 1 white and 1 for a 0/4 wall with Defender. You can pay 1 white and 2 and tap it to tap target creature. That alone isn't super good. But the other ability, you may put a stun counter on it, and if you do, you put a stun counter on Sanctuary Wall. This is actually a lot better than it looks, because what it means is, on one turn, you can pay 3 mana and tap this to tap something down. On the next turn, you can pay 0 mana, and that thing is still tapped down. So it's really only costing you 1.5 mana a turn to tap a thing down if you're using the stun counter, while also having the versatility to potentially just use this as a 0/4 blocker and block aggro threats that way as well when you don't have access to mana. So there's a lot of versatility here. I think that stun counter ability is a little bit better than it seems like it is on the surface. And you should absolutely take it into account and consider it for your limited deck, for sure. Next up, we've got Seasoned Consultant, 1 white and 1 for a 1/3 human detective. Whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures, Seasoned Consultant gets +2/+0 until end of turn. So, it's just a solid card that if you're going super wide, it doesn't even need to be in the detective tribe. It might work really well in that power 2 or less archetype, because it can attack as a 1 power creature and then get some triggers and then get the +2/+0 buff. And since those creatures are power 2 or less, you're probably going wide in that deck. I assume that archetype is a very go wide style archetype. So this is going to be good in any deck that can go wide enough that it can get consistent triggers. It'll be swinging as a 3/3 essentially every turn. But even before you get to that point, just having a 1/3 body, you know, that can block effectively on turn 2 and then start swinging as a 3/3 later on can be pretty good. So this is another one of those commons that I think is a little bit better than it looks and a little bit better than we're used to getting with commons. specifically because I think it's going to be so easy to enable the +2/+0. Next up, we've got 10th District Hero. This is 1 white and 1 for a 2/3 human. You can essentially level it up a lot like evolved something or other. The Phyrexian guy, the 1-mana guy, the black guy. But I think this card is actually a little bit better than that. 2/3 for 2. Pay 1 white and 1, collect evidence 2, which means you have to exile cards from your graveyard with total mana cost 2 or more. And 10th District Hero becomes a human detective with base power and toughness 4/4 and gains vigilance. So he can become a 4/4 vigilance creature by only paying 2 mana, as long as you have a little something in the graveyard. You can also then pay 1 white and 2, collect evidence 4, and if 10th District Hero is a detective, it becomes a legendary creature named Maleva the Stalwart, has base power and toughness 5/5, still keeps the vigilance, and other creatures you control have indestructible. I think this is a lot of value on just one card. And like I said before, Evolved Sleeper, that was the card I was thinking of. I think this is a little bit better than Evolved Sleeper, because the thing about Evolved Sleeper is it's not good until you invest your mana into it. When it comes down as a 1/1 for 1, it needs you to put at least some mana into it before it becomes good. But I think a 2/3 for 2 at its base is a lot better. So you don't fall into the trap of like oh, I have to dump mana into this thing to make it good, to make it worth just even playing and having on the field. And then if your opponent has removal for it, you feel like you got blown out because you wasted your mana leveling it up, and then they just removed it, and instead of playing another creature onto the board with that mana and being left with something when they kill it, you know? So you have that kind of working against it, but I think this card's a little bit better than Evolved Sleeper because, like I said, it comes down as a 2/3 for 2 on its own. You don't feel pressured to have to level it up in order to get the value out of it. So you can sort of play the game with your opponent and force them into a position where they have to use up their removal long before you decide to actually pump the mana into this and do the thing. I think that makes it a little bit of a Trojan horse. You know, you can get it out early, maybe even on curve on 2, and just use it as a normal 2/3 creature, sort of tempt them to use their removal on it, start playing even better creatures, tempt them to have to use their removal on those, and when you feel like you're at a point in the game where now you've got stuff in the graveyard to actually collect evidence with, and you've gotten them to use up a couple removal spells, well, now you can get extra value, give this guy some legs, and, you know, turn on all these abilities and make it a huge game ender, and possibly even protect the rest of your board with that indestructibility. So I think if you play it just right, this guy's going to be pretty good and even better than Evolved Sleeper. But you do have to be careful in how you use it. You have to be careful to avoid getting blown out by removal in response to you using the abilities to level it up, especially things like Cut Down in Standard. But as long as you're careful in how you play this and what deck you use it in, I think this is going to be a really strong card and definitely worth considering for a human tribal deck, that's for sure. Next up, we've got Unyielding Gatekeeper. This is 1 white and 1 for a 3/2 Elephant Cleric. Has Disguise of 1 white and 1. And when it's turned face up, my dog will continue to snore. Exile another target non-land permanent. If you controlled that permanent, you return it to the battlefield tapped immediately. Otherwise, its controller creates a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token. I think what's important to notice about this card is the fact that it can just come down as a 3/2 for 2. It can just be an aggressive creature if you're in a board state where you just need that. You know, if you just need to apply pressure to your opponent's control deck or whatever, push through for damage and try to close out a game, or, you know, try to force them to use up removal they don't want to use, you just play this as a 3/2 for 2 and do that. But it has all this extra versatility of you can disguise it. The ward 2, when you disguise it, helps protect it and, you know, de-emphasize your opponent wanting to actually use their removal on it, which I think is something that's overlooked about these disguise creatures. Because they have the ward 2, it's really hard for your opponent to justify to themselves using their removal on those creatures. Because, like, on the one hand, you really want to, because it could be a really bad, bomby creature that you need to get rid of before it flips, right? And you don't know. But on the other hand, it's like you have to pay an extra 2 mana for removal, when instead you could pay less mana and target the bigger creature that's not a disguised creature that is smashing you in the face right away. So I think Disguise and the Ward 2 that it brings is actually going to be really interesting and definitely work out a little bit differently than Morph ever did. And I think this guy is the recipient of some of that strength, where you can play him on turn 3 as a 2/2 Ward 2. Your opponent is not going to really want to waste their removal and have to spend all of their mana on their turn, instead of like also being able to play a creature alongside their removal spell. And so they might let it slip under the radar, and then you can turn it up at a key moment, and it can be used for either removal. It's kind of almost like a Skyclave apparition, except they get the 2/2 right away. And in some cases that can be kind of better, because now they don't get anything if they kill your gatekeeper, right? You get rid of any permanent, they get a 2/2 right off the bat. They get 0 value if they kill your gatekeeper at that point. So it's kind of interesting. It's better and worse in different ways because of that, but it can hit any non-land permanent at all, and I think that makes it really strong. But the fact that it's got this extra versatility in it, where you can exile another non-land permanent that you control, and it comes back to the battlefield tapped right away, is kind of gnarly. This can be used on a lot of tricks. It can be used to, you know, redo ETB triggers and that sort of thing, but can also be used to unmask a disguise creature without actually having to pay the disguise costs, which is kind of interesting. Any flicker effect is going to be able to take a disguised creature or a cloaked creature and you know, exile it and bring it back into play, and when it comes back into play, it's going to come back in as the front side. So that's just another thing you can do with this. I think the versatility of what this card can be used for, alongside it just being a 3/2 for 2 that you can just slam on the board just for board presence and just to put pressure on your opponent, I think there's enough power and versatility here that this guy is kind of nuts, and I'm pretty excited to brew with it, to be honest. Next up, we've got Wojek Investigator. This was actually one of the very first cards to be spoiled forever ago. This is a 2/4 Angel Detective for 1 white and 2. It has flying and vigilance, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you investigate once for each opponent who has more cards in hand than you. Now, obviously, this is going to be a lot better in Commander and other multiplayer variants, because you get multiple triggers, and you can just make a ton of clue tokens. But even in just normal standard, like a 2/4 flying vigilance, that's going to hopefully get you a clue token every single turn that you can eventually draw cards with, or maybe just use for, you know, artifact synergies like Oni Cult Anvil and things like that. That's just a lot of value on an already decent flying vigilance 2/4 body for only 3 mana. So I think this guy doesn't pop so much and have a lot of like ooh and ah, but at the end of the day, I think it's going to be a really good card. It dodges cut down, it dodges lightning strike and shock, like it dodges so much different removal, gets you card advantage turn after turn, is an evasive attacker and blocker at the same time because of vigilance. It just kind of does everything, and it's in 2 very relevant creature types, Angel and Detective. So I definitely think there's going to be some use of this card in Standard. I don't know which decks are going to make the most use of it. Maybe there's a Detective Tribal deck that's good enough that hits Standard. More likely there's an Angel Tribal deck that's good enough that sees play in Standard, and this guy sees play in it. But it's definitely going to show up somewhere. And obviously, this is just a windmill slam for Limited, so grab it while you can and, you know, use it to win the game. And the last card in white is Wrench. This is 1 white mana for an artifact clue equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has vigilance, and pay 3, tap it to tap target creature. Because it is a clue equipment, you can also pay 2 and sacrifice Wrench to draw a card, and it equips for 2. Now, what's worth noting is, unlike other clues, you don't have to sacrifice this, or sorry, you do have to sacrifice it, but you don't have to tap it and sacrifice it in order to draw the card, which means you can have it equipped to a creature. You can swing with that creature, and because of the vigilance, still have it untapped, after combat or in the middle of combat, you could pay 3, tap this, pay 3, tap the creature, tap something you don't want to block while you're still attacking because of the vigilance. So you can swing and still use this ability to prevent them from blocking it. And then afterwards, you can just pay 2 and sack the wrench to draw a card if you want, or if you run out of creatures on the board and you have nothing to equip this on, you can pay 2, sack the wrench to try and dig deeper and find another threat. Like, the versatility of that, the idea of these different equipments that we're seeing in this set not being useless if you're out of creatures, and having ways to try and help you mitigate being out of creatures, I think makes them a lot more usable. And it appears on the surface like they're just as usable as previous equipments, but in reality, I think a lot of these equipments we're seeing in this set are more usable and limited than a lot of past equipments, and I'm expecting them to pop up a lot more often. So anyway, that was my set review for white. So many more are on the way. Blue's up next, I believe, and then we'll do black, red, green. We're going to do a colorless one, and then we're going to do a multicolor one, and then I'm going to do my top 10 for constructed, top 5 cards for limited, and then after all of that, we're going to do a video detailing the 10 decks I'm excited to brew as soon as the set launches. And if you guys go and become a patron over on Patreon, you can vote on what order you want to see those pop up, and which ones you're most excited to see pop up, even at just the $1 tier. So if you're interested in that, definitely become a patron. I would appreciate the support a ton. That was my set review for white for Murders at KARLOV Manor. I'm excited to get to the rest, and I will see you guys then. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck text, that's somewhere over there. And if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.